AP World History Modern. This is the podcast for topic 6.2, State Expansion, our essential question. By what processes did state power shift in various parts of the world between 1750 and 1900? Topic number 1. I'm going to try to help you take some organized notes here. If you want to underline this, Imperialism in Africa. So I got a big idea for you on this topic. The big idea here is that, Europe had a long-standing relationship with Africa because of the slave trade, right? We've talked about this. And most European countries had declared that the importation of slaves from Africa is illegal by the early 1800s. However, Europe continues to import and export goods to and from Africa. Some of those goods that they exported from Europe to Africa were guns, alcohol, and manufactured goods. Imports from Africa to Europe, palm oil, gold, and ivory. So I got 2 takeaways for you on this topic. Then we can move on. In the last part of the 19th century, Europeans with their 2 biggest incentives to be in Africa and this trade with Africa, import and export with Africa, I should say, it's diamonds and ivory. Those are 2 big ones to keep them there. Diamonds and ivory. Gold's right behind that too. And the second takeaway is the reason that England needed this palm oil, because it keeps their machinery in its textile factories from becoming rusty. This is key, whether we're talking about Africa, Latin America. A big theme here, what's going on, and it's really setting the stage for, next couple centuries. The Industrial Revolution and imperialism, it's drawing a line in the sand. You're starting to see who are going to be the haves and the have-nots. Who's subordinate to who is supplying who. So the bigger countries and the bigger economies like Europe and the United States, you're going to see, I need your natural resources to keep my machine running, right? So that's going to be a justification to do the things that they're doing. Okay, subtopic A. So if you're taking notes, underline this: expanding beyond trading post. What's the big idea here? For most of the 1800s, Europe's presence in Africa was restricted to trading posts with few exceptions. There's 3 takeaways for you. The French, the Dutch, and the British expanded their presence in the second half of the 1800s. The discovery of malaria medicine reduced the danger of living in warm, humid regions, so they're not as afraid to go there. And 3, the steamship assisted the early trips of individual explorers and business owners. So subtopic A, again, is expanding beyond trading post. Okay, subtopic B, British control of Egypt. The Suez Canal is completed in 1869. What the Suez Canal did, it connected the Red Sea with the Mediterranean. It was about 100 miles long. And what this did is it saved you a trip from going all the way around the entire continent of Africa. So again, time is money. If we can save time, if we can get goods places faster, right, it's more money. So for this subtopic B, British control of Egypt, I got 5 takeaways for you. A French company managed the project, but most of the labor, it was done by 1.5 million Egyptians. They were unpaid workers who were forced to work on the project, and this was considered a form of taxation. Thousands died in the course of 10 years. Now this is where you gotta come to your own conclusion and your own opinion. The word slavery is not used, but unpaid workers who died working on this thing. I mean, what do you call that? And the last takeaway: when Egyptians started rebelling against Britain, they started threatening its commercial interest. Britain seized control of Egypt away from the Ottoman Empire. So there's another example of, you're seeing a pecking order. You're seeing who's subordinate to who's going to be, these countries are like suppliers. In the corporate world, you have suppliers. Like here in Detroit, Ford, GM, Chrysler, they have other companies that supply them. And they say, like, if Ford Motor Company catches a cold, the suppliers get pneumonia, right? Because well, here you're seeing where these countries, it's like, man, your culture, nothing exists anymore. You exist just to supply us with your goods, whether they're natural resources or manufactured. Okay, let's go to the next subtopic. Subtopic C, British West Africa. The big idea here. Great Britain established several colonies in West Africa before the mid-19th century. In these colonies, Britain spread Western education, the English language, and Christianity. Okay, 7 takeaways. I got 7 for you on this subtopic C, which is British West Africa. Sierra Leone was established in 1787. It was home for free people from throughout the British Empire who had been enslaved. 2. Gambia was established in 1816. It and Sierra Leone were used as bases to try to stop the export of enslaved people from the region. 3. Lagos became a crown colony in 1861 and served as a base for the annexation of much of the rest of what is now Nigeria. Britain acquired parts of what is now Ghana in states. For example, the Gold Coast became a crown colony in 1874, but the Asante Empire to the north did not come under British control until 1901. Your 5th takeaway, Britain used both diplomacy and warfare to expand its empire. 6. Britain created and signed treaties with African rulers, agreeing to trade terms favorable to both sides. 7. As European competition increased for control of African lands, the treaties came to be meaningless, and warfare was the inevitable result as Africans resisted takeover but met with overpowering military strength. So there's another commonality you're going to see here. I don't care who you are, where you're from. People don't like being exploited. People don't like having their culture turned upside down. People don't like, I'm not here just to make you rich. My people, my country, in this case, my continent, we're not just here to serve you. Okay, let's move to subtopic D, the French in Africa. What's the big idea with this topic? It's a quick one. France drove the Ottomans out of Algeria in 1830. By 1870, Algeria had become a settler colony, attracting a Spanish, Italian, and Maltese as well as French immigrants. I got 1 takeaway for you for this, subtopic D, the French in Africa. The takeaway is, in the 1870s, the French also established trading posts in Guinea, the Ivory Coast, and Niger to compete with British West African colonies. Okay, let's go to topic number 2, the European Scramble for Africa. The big idea here is that tensions mounted among industrialized European nations as they competed for natural resources in Africa. Leaders feared that what they called the Scramble for Africa, that the competing efforts of Europeans to colonize Africa would lead to war. So now, they're bumping heads. They want these natural resources, but it looks like the big industrial powers could end up going to war with each other over Africa. So that's your big idea on this whole topic. Now I'm going to break it down in subtopics for you. Subtopic A is the Berlin Conference. The big idea is Otto von Bismarck. Remember we talked about him in class. Otto von Bismarck of Germany had little interest in colonies, but he wanted to keep the peace in Europe. Okay? I know if you remember your 20th century history, is kind of ironic. You got Germany trying to keep the peace in Europe, but that's what's going on. So I got 3 takeaways for you on this subtopic A, the Berlin Conference. In 1884 to 1885, he's going to host this thing. It's a meeting of the European powers, and they're trying to find like an orderly way to colonize Africa. Of course, no Africans were invited to the conference. Nobody really cared about how the Africans felt about being colonized, but the purpose was the European powers, so they don't bump heads, they don't go to war. Let's figure out a way, to colonize and, take all their resources without starting a war between us. The second takeaway for you. Europeans are going to establish these colonial borders that they kind of made up themselves, and they're going to divide it. This is what was really kind of inept on their part. They divide it like along societies that are, unified, and then other colonies, it was like united, like where they got along, but they also include rival groups into the same colony. So they just kind of randomly set these borders. So you had groups in Africa that didn't like each other, or rivals. So this was kind of a dumb idea on their part, not doing their homework, not understanding, the history of this continent that they're invading, right? Then this is going to have long-term effects. So your third takeaway is, when you move forward, this is moving ahead here, but when these colonies become independent later in the 20th century, the borders that were established by the Europeans, it's going to cause extensive warfare. And it's going to make like national unity very difficult, because you have like rival groups together, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So this wasn't just issue. This doesn't cause problems at that time. Later on, you're talking later 20th century. This still causes problems for Africa. Okay. Subtopic B, South Africa and the Boer War. The big idea here is that during the Napoleonic Wars, the British replaced the Dutch in the Cape Colony in the southern tip of Africa. The Napoleonic Wars were like 1799 to 1815. Again, you don't have to memorize these dates. It's just a frame of reference. But I got 7 takeaways for you here for your subtopic B, South Africa and the Boer War. The British introduced the use of English, but allowed people to use the Dutch language as well. Second takeaway. Many of the Dutch-speaking Afrikaners, not Africans, Afrikaners, they spoke Dutch, the descendants of the 17th century Dutch settlers. Okay, so these are the descendants of Dutch-speaking original settlers. So these people are white Europeans, okay, Afrikaners. They moved east to the Cape Colony, where they came into conflict with indigenous groups, including the Zulus, with whom they fought several wars. Your third takeaway. Throughout the 19th century, the British and Afrikaners continued to fight over land. This conflict came to a boil in the Boer Wars. It was 1880 to 1881, and then again in 1899 and 1902. In the end, this is your fourth takeaway, the British Army drove the Afrikaners and the Africans from their lands, forcing many into refugee camps. Okay, your fifth takeaway. These settlements, which were segregated by race, came to be known as concentration camps. Medical care and sanitation were poor, and people were dying of starvation. White camps received some relief from activists, but black camps remained terrible. Of the 100,000 blacks intended in concentration camps or interned, nearly 15,000 died. Okay, takeaway 6. By the end of the Boer Wars, the British had absorbed the settler colonies of British and Afrikaner peoples and the black Africans in the southern tip of Africa into its empire. And your last takeaway, 7. Millions of Afrikaner and black African farmers have been displaced onto poor land, making it hard for them to make a living. So we keep seeing this theme. What do you think? Does might make right? Do these countries have a right to do this? Because They're more industrialized. They have a better military. It's up for you to decide. Subtopic C, we're going to talk about the Congo. The big idea here with the Congo, in 1875, Western European nations were poised to penetrate Africa's interior. King Leopold II of Belgium, he rules from 1865 to 1909. He oversaw the invasion and pacification of the Congo in Central Africa in order to persuade the Belgian government to support colonial expansion. Okay, some of the takeaways here. Okay, so I got 6 takeaways, and King Leopold, take good notes here. This doesn't get talked about as much as it should. Some brutal stuff. He's a little different with Belgium. He owns the colony personally, and he's gonna use this. It's this ruthless system, as the book calls it, economic exploitation, that allows him to keep the profits made from the Congo Free State. It's gonna total about 220 million francs. That's about $1 billion in today's money. So you're talking $1 billion, and this guy was just absolutely ruthless. There was very brutal conditions for the laborers. They were forced to harvest ivory and rubber, were 2 big exports. Like one thing this guy did, Leopold, like he would have his guys cut the hands off of a worker. Say the worker wasn't doing what they were supposed to, or they were being insubordinate, cut their hands off, and so everyone else could see it. So he just terrorized these poor people and forced them to work for him. And workers had a quota. If they didn't meet their quota, the penalty, you were beaten or you were killed. So how's that for a work policy? And some were just worked to death. They just worked them until they died. And again, in the Amsco text brings this up. And I know I said it before, but even though the term slavery is not used here, here in the Congo, like other places we've been talking about, once again, the workers are receiving no payment for this work that's killing them, literally. And Leopold, he went as far as he would kidnap their spouses and hold them hostage so that they wouldn't run away. Because you're doing this, like, this guy's going to work me to death. I'm not getting any money. I'm going to try to get the heck out of here, right? He would kidnap their spouses so they wouldn't run away. So this is brutal stuff. And there's just a huge number of people that died under King Leopold's reign. It's 8 million. And this was, it's called a reign of terror in the Congo. 8 million people. That's more people than Hitler killed in the Holocaust. It's unbelievable. Just in the Congo. In 1908, Belgium takes control of the Congo as a regular colony, and conditions do improve. But that time of anytime, if you ever get a DBQ on Leopold II of Belgium, I mean, you got a lot of stuff to talk about there. Pretty horrible. Let's move on to subtopic D, independent countries. So the big idea here is that by 1900, the only African countries unclaimed by Europeans was Ethiopia and Liberia. Liberia is a country that was founded by formerly enslaved people from the U.S. If you remember the Abraham Lincoln story, I think I told you last year. The major takeaway here, this is a quick little topic. Because Liberia had a dependent relationship with the U.S., it was not fully independent. Italy attempts to conquer Ethiopia in 1895, but the native forces were too strong for the Italians. So kind of what that it tells you is that, pretty much the entire continent is being used by these European powers. Okay, let's move to topic number 3, imperialism in South Asia. So now we're moving to South Asia. What's the big idea here? Portugal, France, and England competed for control of India's spices, gems, and trade with regions to the east. I got 4 major takeaways for you here. First one, Portugal, they established a coastal trading port in the southwestern coast of Goa in the early 16th century, but it never extended its control inland. Remember, Portugal was good at what, right? Maritime empires, right? 2, France established trading ports in the 17th century. However, its loss to Britain in the global conflict known as the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1762, drove the French out of India. So one thing you remember about 7 Years' War, that it drives the French out of India. Now, if you remember in U.S. history, what did we call the war here? And what was at the time the colonies, and especially here in Detroit, the Detroit River, the fur trade, we call it the French and Indian War, with similar results, right? Okay, number 3. England's East India Company steadily encroached on the land of the weak Mughal Empire. Not Mongol, Mughal. Remember them? Number 4. Eventually, Britain controlled the entire Indian subcontinent. So make sure you know that. The crown jewel of the British Empire. Okay, topic number 4. Imperialism in East Asia. What's the big idea here? China did not experience imperialism in the same way that South Asia or Africa did. It maintained its own government. So make sure you have that in your notes. China maintains its own government. This is a different situation here throughout this period of European economic domination. Okay, I got 12 takeaways for this, a big topic. As a result of superior military strength, European nations carved out spheres of influence within China over what they had exclusive trading rights and access to natural resources. 2, internal problems within the Qing government, such as the Taiping Rebellion. It made it easier for foreign countries to dominate the economic affairs of China, right? So what that means, because they're having internal issues, it's the old divide and conquer. It made it easier for Europe. And starving peasants in this rebellion, starving peasants, workers, miners, they were attempting to overthrow the Qing dynasty. And in your notes, remember, Qing dynasty is Qing. It doesn't sound like it looks. Number 4, with the help of some warlords, along with the French and British intervention, the Qing prevailed in 1864. So they quashed the rebellion. Number 5, in the midst of the war, adding to China's internal problems, the Yellow River, it ends up changing courses, and it's going to flood farmlands in some areas, and it's going to leave other areas open to drought. So you can guess what's coming up next. The 6th takeaway is famine. Because of this, you're getting famine in China. People are starving to death. Number 7, adding to all this stuff, the bubonic plague broke out at this time. So things are just really going sideways here in China. 8, the rebellion was probably responsible for the deaths of more than 20 million people, more than half of whom were civilians. So kind of these numbers I'm throwing out to you, 8 million in the Congo because of King Leopold II, 20 million here. Just add the millions and millions of people. Why are they dying? Industrial Revolution, imperialism, goods, trade, money, man. It's all about money. 9, between 1899 and 1901, an anti-imperialist group called the Boxers. Okay, they were named this because of their members practiced martial arts, and they were known as Chinese boxers, and they were attacking Chinese Christians and Western missionaries. So I got a good book here. This is a very interesting topic. I got The Boxer Rebellion by Diana Preston. Got here in my study. I'm going to read this one. Man, it's been 20 years. So I read this book in 2000, and this really goes into detail about the Boxer Rebellion and what happened. Because what the Empress, remember we talked about Empress Cixi, she has a little different take. And they kind of, think about everything I've been telling you so far in this podcast. She puts a hit on all foreigners. She tells the Boxers, we're going to kill all the foreigners that are here trying to exploit us. So she has a little different take on this. And one thing I remember from this book, there was like a compound. They had like Christian missionaries and some British I forgot what their titles were, but it was missionaries. I think some other Brits were there, along with some Chinese Christians. And the Boxers surrounded this compound. And they were kind of like just starving them out. Like they couldn't leave. So one of them would try to leave to either get help or try to go get supplies. And they would cut their head off, stick their head on a spike, and put the spike right in front of the compound so everybody inside was just staring at this severed head sitting on a spike. So it was kind of like, who's next? Who's going to try it next? This was really brutal stuff. And the Empress really kind of goes after the foreigners. They're going to end up killing about 100,000 people. Most of them were Chinese Christians. As far as foreigners go, they killed about between 200 and 250 foreigners. And again, this was called the Boxer Rebellion. But I recommend, if you got to read a history book or you're interested, Diana Preston, The Boxer Rebellion, good book. Your last takeaway. And this, China, because of this pretty radical decision, China ends up having to pay over $330 million to foreign countries. And then China gets banned from importing weapons for a couple of years as well. And then the Boxer Rebellion, this is going to lead to the fall of the Qing dynasty. So finally the Qing dynasty falls. So the Boxer Rebellion had a lot of effects. You talk about cause and effects. But you kind of see the hypocrisy too. Like the European nations are going to fine China $330 million for killing all these people. But, again, it's up to you to decide. But from the perspective of the Chinese and the Empress Dowager, it's like, oh, we don't want to be exploited by you. How dare us defend ourselves? How dare us stand up for ourselves? How dare us want you out of here? We don't exist just to make you rich, right? That was their perspective. But the Europeans were like, you're going to pay us and you're not going to get any more weapons. How dare you rebel against us, right? Okay. We're going to move to Japan. So subtopic A is Japan. Okay, your big idea here. Japan overthrew its traditional government in an uprising. And it began to rapidly industrialize, hoping it would become strong enough to protect its distinctive culture. So what Japan has a different take. Like we have to modernize, we have to keep up, or we're going to get left behind. Because see, that was the other thing. You didn't just want to industrialize so you could make money. You don't want to be on the other side of this. Like if we don't modernize, if we're not able to keep up, we're going to be one of these countries that just exist to supply the bigger countries, right? So I got 6 takeaways for you on this. Industrialized countries outside of Europe, they're desiring colonies too. So this is the thing. Everybody wants to get in, all the industrial countries, they need to get in on this colony thing. So Japan, they had sharply limited its contact with countries since the early 1600s. Japan's trying to do both. They want to modernize and they want to keep their culture intact. Japan's going to look outward and they're going to look for territorial gains. They're an island, and the problem with their island is they got few natural resources, and land is at a premium. So it's tough for them to kind of fuel their growth, right? Japan's government, they actually encouraged agricultural workers to take seasonal contracts, like in Hawaii and Guam and other places like that. And through a colonization society established in 1893, leaders are going to establish colonies in Mexico, Latin America. Japan set up an empire in East Asia that included parts of China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands that lasted from the 1890s until the end of World War II. And we'll get to that. There's going to be another big change for Japan after World War II. Okay, topic number 5, imperialism in Southeast Asia. Subtopic A, the Dutch. The big idea here, Portugal and Spain originally controlled European trade with Southeast Asia. After 1600, there's going to be a power shift, and the English and the Dutch are going to take out Portugal and Spain regarding Southeast Asian trade. So I got about 8 takeaways for you on this topic. The first one, Dutch imperialism in Southeast Asia began with a private company. Right, you've heard this before. In 1641, the Dutch seized control of the Spice Islands, so-called because they produced spices such as cloves and nutmeg that were in great demand in Europe. This company is called the Dutch East India Company, and they're going to take over the spice trade from who? The Portuguese, setting up several trading posts on the archipelago. What's an archipelago, by the way? Make sure you know that. It's like a series of islands, right? Okay, number 4, although the trade was very profitable, corruption is going to cause the company to go bankrupt by 1800. Once it folds, the Dutch government itself is going to take control of the Dutch East Indies. So now it's just the government. By the mid-19th century, the islands were producing cash crops to support the Dutch economy. Plantations produced tea, rubber, sugar for exporting purposes. Now, this is a big theme here. I know right now we're talking about the Dutch, but this is a theme that's going to be happening all over the world. And remember our Ayn Rand Che Guevara lecture on Friday. This is the kind of thing Che Guevara is going to see, and it's going to cause him to have a very negative opinion of capitalism, right? The exact opposite of Ayn Rand. And this is going to happen everywhere. Because you're producing these cash crops, right? And again, you're supporting the mother country, the country that's colonized you. That limited the rice cultivation, and it eventually created a lot of hardships for Indonesian farmers who relied on rice to survive. So not only do I have to work and create this cash crop that you benefit from, not me, I don't have the time or the space to grow food. So this is just an example of the exploitation. And here we're talking about Indonesia, but you can spread this all over Africa, Latin America. That's what these farmers are going through. So you can see why some people don't like this imperialism thing, right? 8, the Dutch government implemented humanitarian reforms, but nowhere near the level needed to meet the needs of the Indonesian people. Okay, let's move on to subtopic B, the French in Southeast Asia. The big idea here is that the French government also wanted imperial presence in Asia. I got 3 main takeaways for you on this one. Okay, after it defeated China in the Sino-French War, that was 1883 to 1885, France gained control of northern Vietnam. And man, that's going to be a long story. We'll be talking about into the 20th century. 2, by the 1890s, France controlled Cambodia, Laos, and all of modern-day Vietnam. Together, these nations became known as French Indochina. Now, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam are still there, They're just not known as French Indochina anymore. Okay, 3. French motives for imperialism were like those of the Dutch. A desire for cash crops. In this particular case, rubber plantations are going to just be all over the landscape of Cambodia and Vietnam. Right? And how is that, detrimental to the people of Cambodia and Vietnam? You can't eat rubber, right? They're not growing food. Okay, now we can move on to subtopic C, the British in Southeast Asia. Your big idea here, the British influenced Southeast Asia. It's going to begin with the East India Company acquiring the islands of Penang off the northwest coast of the Malay Peninsula in 1786. I got 3 takeaways for you. In 1824, the British founded the port of Singapore. Chinese immigrants soon made it the most important seaport in Southeast Asia. Your second takeaway, eventually Britain controlled all of the Malay Peninsula, Burma, and northern Borneo. By the end of the 19th century, Malaya was the world's greatest producer of natural rubber. We're going to go to subtopic D, Siam. Right? Where's Siam? If you look at a map today, there's no Siam, right? It's modern day Thailand. Okay, so what's the big idea here? Siam's the only Southeast Asian nation that managed to escape the clutches of 19th century European imperialism. What's your takeaway? Siam implemented modernizing reforms on its own and built up its own industrial infrastructure. So that's a good thing to know. That it's short, quick topic, but very relevant. Siam, modern-day Thailand, they avoid European imperialism. Okay, topic number 6, Australia and New Zealand. What's the big idea here? Okay, and it's, you see how we're shifting, right? Make sure you understand the different regions that we're talking about as we move topics. Your big idea is after the loss of its American colonies, Britain began to consider the possibility of establishing various kinds of settlements in Australia. And this was a little different. They're going to use it as a penal colony. They're going to send prisoners, or they're going to send their convicts here. It's a dumping ground for them. I got about 7 takeaways for you on this topic. Topic number 6, Australia and New Zealand. In 1788, the first convicts, along with some free settlers, arrived in Australia, and the East Coast became known as New South Wales. Second takeaway, in the 1820s, Britain took possession of the entire continent. 3, for decades, the chief economic activity of the colony was to house convicts. Number 4, in the 1830s, free settlers began to arrive. 5th takeaway, Australia would produce fine wool as well as natural resources with the discovery of copper in 1842 and gold in 1851. 6th takeaway, when Britain annexed the settler colony New Zealand in 1839, it was made a part of New South Wales. And just so you know, this isn't in your AMSCO text, but I got a lot of family in Australia. It was a strange relationship with Great Britain. It wasn't until I was a teenager, it was like in 1986, that Australia gets a complete official break from Great Britain. They separate. So that's a long time. That was 1986. Okay, let's move on to topic number 7, U.S. imperialism in Latin America and the Pacific. Now we're talking about the U.S. Now what I'm going to talk about in this topic, you learned this in 9th grade U.S. history. Some of this should sound familiar. And again, I'm going over some big topics, and I'm going to go through them quickly. It kind of kills me to go through these quickly. But this isn't U.S. history, right? In the U.S. history class, this would be 2 or 3 weeks worth of material. But I got to go through these quickly. If you don't remember some of these things, or if you don't know what I'm referencing, please ask me. Whether it's your thesis for your DBQ, whether it's, the content from the AMSCO text, I got 6-hour prep. I can always, tutor or review stuff. All right. The big idea here for topic number 7, U.S. imperialism in Latin America and the Pacific. During the 19th century, the U.S. continued taking land from indigenous peoples, as Europeans had done since Columbus arrived. I got 13 takeaways for you. These are big takeaways. The forced relocation of eastern woodland peoples from the southeast to a new Indian territory in what is now Oklahoma. So many Native Americans died from exposure, malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion that this forced migration became known as the Trail of Tears. And you should remember that from 9th grade U.S. history. Remember a guy, Andrew Jackson, maybe, right, would become, the 7th president of the United States? 2. In 1823, President James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine. This stated that European nations should not intervene in the affairs of the countries in the Western Hemisphere. So what that means, the United States saying, look, you guys are colonizing, Southeast Asia, you got Africa pretty much covered. You went all the way over to Australia, New Zealand. Don't come over here, bro. This is our turf. We're going to colonize the people over here. Okay, we need to beat some people up too, right? Okay, so implied in the doctrine was a desire to be an imperial power in the Americas. So the United States, we're going to be playing this game too, right? The colony game. This desire played out in the U.S. war with Mexico in 1845 to 1848, through which the U.S. gained vast territories in southwest Mexico. So hopefully you know this, but if you don't, make sure, Google a map of Mexico before the war and after the war, and look how much land the United States gained from Mexico. Okay, number 4, white Americans believed that they had a manifest destiny, a natural and inevitable right to expand to the Pacific Ocean. Manifest destiny is a very controversial, highly debated term. And it's up to you what you think about it. But look at the historical facts. I was involved in a discussion at the university once. Manifest destiny compared and contrast to Lebensraum. What's Lebensraum? That's German for living space. That was Hitler's justification for what he did when he took, remember the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, all that the Germans needed more living space. So this is a moral conflict here. When I was a kid, playing cowboys and Indians, right, in the 1970s, the Indians were the bad guys, right, and the cowboys were the good guys. And you read this stuff, it's pretty tough to read. If one group says, well, I'm going to kick you off your land, we're going to kill, we're going to rape, we're going to steal, but it's okay because God wants us to. So how do you really argue that? Like, how do you say, God told you to do this? Oh, your God told you to do this. So we have different religion. So this is very controversial, to buy into this. And it gives you this clean slate. It gives you, a blank slate, I should say, to kind of do what you want. And it justifies what's going to be some pretty horrible stuff. But, it builds the country, right? And I'm being a total hypocrite. I got a house, I got a mortgage. If Native Americans said, hey, this used to be Indian land, give me your house, I wouldn't do that, right? I mean, I paid for this house. So this is a rough part of our history. So, okay, number 5. The U.S. bought Alaska from Russia in 1867. Number 6. In 1869, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad spurred development of the American West. And we talked about this in class a little bit. The railroads, right? Chinese labor and Irish labor. So Irish immigrants and Chinese immigrants. Long, dangerous work. People died building these railroads, especially when they came up with nitroglycerin to help build the railroads. Dangerous dangerous work. And they left the most dangerous stuff for the Irish and the Chinese. As white settlers moved westward to take advantage of offers of free land, Native Americans were forced into reservations. And this is good stuff to know too. Immigration is a big topic now. With the election coming up, people have very strong feelings one way or the other on immigration. But you see, there's a difference between opinion and a historically defensible claim, right? Like we say in our DBQs. But you're seeing, the Irish, the Chinese, the Native Americans, are help building this country to their expense. The Native Americans are getting pushed off their land, and we're using a lot of immigrant labor to build things. 8, the U.S. turned its focus to lands overseas. 9, the U.S. was not a global power for most of the 19th century, so it wasn't the United States that we know of today. We weren't really a big player yet. 10, a group of American planners overthrew Hawaii's constitutional monarchy in 1895. But the islands, they don't become a U.S. territory until 1900. Even Hawaii, again, I just knowing this history, how oftentimes I feel like a hypocrite, and it's really a moral dilemma. So my wife and I get married in August of 2002. So we take our honeymoon in Hawaii, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. If you ever get a chance to go to Hawaii, I highly recommend it. And I had some friends in Hawaii. It was really cool. So we got like a really cool tour, kind of off the beaten path, not just the usual touristy stuff. And we got a lot of history of the island. But my friends even told me, say, don't go on this part of the island. It's more the natives. They don't like tourists and all that. So, of course, we went anyway. And they were so nice. They were so sweet. They made a couple things for my wife and I. They gave us a lot of the history. We walked on the beach and just listened to some stories. And this is 2002. And the back of their cars, like they had pickup trucks, the back window of a lot of the pickup trucks, the bumpers of the regular cars, they had like a picture of the Hawaiian Islands. And it said stolen. And they really feel like, we had our own culture, our own people. This was stolen. We just became a military base for the United States. Our culture, our people, our existence. Now, we were, because of geography, where we were, we just became a military base. So they're still upset about it. Again, these are tough topics to try to wrap your brain around. But I'm going to move to number 11. The U.S. victory in the Spanish-American War in 1898 brought Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines under U.S. control. You should remember that from 9th grade U.S. history. Maybe you remember the Maine, the ship that explodes, right? Very controversial. Kind of starts the little war. Hopefully I'm ringing some bells here. 12. Teddy Roosevelt was especially eager to expand U.S. influence throughout the Western Hemisphere. Remember we talked about Roosevelt when we read Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. He went after monopolies and trust. He was a trust buster. But like a lot of people, Teddy Roosevelt, I read a biography on him. There's a lot of things you think, oh, wow, you really admire some of the things he did. But then sometimes you're like, wait a minute, holy cow. Like he kind of bought into social Darwinism. And he had an expression like, we stole Panama fair and square. But, human beings, especially leaders that make tough decisions, and, they're complicated. 13. I know you covered this in 9th grade U.S. history. This is a big topic in 9th grade U.S. history. The 1904 Roosevelt Corollary. It stated if countries in Latin America demonstrated instability, the U.S. would intervene. So how's that for a policy? If your country looks unstable, we're coming in. right? Again, if you're on the U.S. side, maybe you like that idea. It's going to make your economy stronger. If you're not on the U.S. side, you might not like somebody coming into your country, right? Okay. So that was kind of a U.S. history review. We're going to move over to topic number 8, Russian expansion. What's the big idea here? Empress Catherine II, better known as Catherine the Great. She's going to set out to expand the Russian Empire in all directions during her reign. Her reign from 1762 to 1806. And no, I'm sorry, 1796. She reigned from 1762 to 1796. I think that's when she died. She ruled until her death, and she's going to annex half of Poland, as well as territory won from the Ottoman Empire. So I got 3 takeaways for you. Then we can wrap up this podcast. Catherine the Great's grandson, Alexander I, annexed Finland, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and part of Armenia during his reign, 1815 to 1825. Your second takeaway, Russia continued to push into Central Asia during the 19th century, leading to an intense rivalry between the Russian and British empires as they competed unsuccessfully for dominance in Afghanistan, a rivalry would be known as the Great Game. And the last takeaway on this topic, Russia also succeeded in annexing lands from China, most notably a large portion of Manchuria. So this was a big topic, and you do see a pattern. You see industrialized countries subjugating smaller countries. They're getting free labor, and they're taking a lot of their natural resources. And a lot of these resources are to literally and figuratively fuel these new industrialized nations, because industry, to keep running, needs a lot of these natural resources. So definitely a cause and effect there, right? Who wins, who loses, it depends what side you're on. And it depends if your country modernized in time or not. It depends if your country can defend itself or not, right? Okay, hope you took good notes, and I will see you in the next one.